Hi, I'm Zakaria, an assistant professor at Birla Institute of Technology and Science Planning, Hyderabad campus. Professor Nanak Kakwani delivered a lecture to students of development economics on September 18, 2020. The lecture was attended by undergraduate, graduate, and faculty members of BITS Planning. In this lecture, Professor Kakwani has attempted to explain complex idea of income inequality in a layman's language. His lecture follows now.
Start my lecture, I want to give you my brief introduction that I did all my education in Delhi. I went to Birla Higher Secondary School in Kamlanagar, and I did my BSc Honors and Masters in Hindu College. And then I moved to IIT Kanpur for a very short period, and where I started my PhD. My supervisor moved to Delhi School of Economics, so I followed him and I joined Delhi School of Economics. At that time, Delhi School of Economics was a great place for economics. It has the most famous professors at that time. Among them were Amartya Sen, Jagdish Bhagwati, and Sukma Chakravarti, and A.L. Nagar, and Khalid Naqvi, and many others. So it was a great time for me, great learning from these well-known professors. And then I finished my PhD. I went to England, then came back to India, then eventually I ended up in the University of New South Wales, where I was professor for 30 years. So that is my brief introduction. I'm going to present now. Okay, as I pointed out, that at Delhi School of Economics, the Amartya Sen was their professor. Later on, he moved on to London School of Economics, and then to Oxford, Cambridge, and then to Harvard University. So he was awarded Nobel Prize in 1998. Now he is professor at Harvard University. And I actually met him last year. I had a lunch with him at Cambridge. So he is still very active, producing a lot of research in the economics and philosophy. He is a joint professor of economics and philosophy. He has done research in many areas, and his work has been a great inspiration for me. Actually, more than 4 decades ago, 1973, he wrote a book on economic inequality. And that is one of the best books I have ever read on inequality. So in the preface to the book, he wrote that idea of inequality is both very simple and very complex. According to him, inequality is the simplest of all ideas that have moved many people with an immediate appeal, hardly matched by any other concepts. Actually, there has been huge concern for many, many years about the rising inequality or high inequality. The phenomena of inequality has been a source of worldwide upheaval. And you must be knowing, everybody knows about Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. He was the first Prime Minister of India, and he wrote many books. Among them, his book on glimpses of world history was the most popular. In that book, he had a quote that democracy, if it means anything, means equality. Not merely equality of possessing vote, but economic and social equality. So even in India, there was a lot of concern about inequality. And now the actually concern, even in America, which was not very much concerned about inequality, but now many people there are realizing that high inequality is unfair and injustice. More recently, there has been a popular movement that movement is called 1% against 99%. There has been a concern that for last 3-4 decades, income of the top 1% has been increasing much more rapidly than income of the bottom 99%. So this movement is popularly known as 1% against 99%. Now, there have been many books on inequality now. Inequality has a lot of cost to the society. Actually, Joseph Stiglitz came out with a book, The Price of Inequality. Actually, my personal experience, I went to Brazil. I spent few years there. I could feel that high inequality, how damaging high inequality is in the society. I mean, Brazil, there are a lot of rich people, but at the same time, many poor people living in favelas, where they are involved with crimes and drugs and so on. There are many policy questions often raised about inequality. How great is inequality? Which way is it moving? What are the effect of government social programs on income inequality? I mean, many governments now have many social programs. Actually, the World Bank has brought out a atlas of all these social programs. Millions and millions of people are now covered by social welfare programs in many countries. And then issues are also taxation. Which of the taxes and government transfers lead to greater or less equality in income distribution? So this is a big area which I have been very much interested. So in this lecture, I will explain the concept of inequality in a layman's language, in a simple, possible way. It's a difficult topic. It's a challenge for me, and I have undertaken that challenge. Okay, let me start explaining what inequality is about. Let us consider a hypothetical society which consists of only two individuals, A and B, whose incomes are given by two hypothetical scenarios, distribution 1 and distribution 2. Now, person A and B and distribution 1 and 2. So person A gets $250 or 50 rupees. B gets 250 rupees. Total distribution amount is 500. And distribution 2 is person A gets only 100 and B gets 400. Now here you can see that the distribution 1 is perfectly equal in the sense that two persons are getting exactly the same income. Let us give an analogy of cake, division of cake. Supposing, this cake has to be divided between two persons, A and B. So person A gets 50% of the cake and person B gets another 50% of the cake. So this, I would say, is a fair distribution of just distribution of the cake. But if you have the distribution 2, here A gets only 1/4 of the cake and B gets under distribution 2, B gets all 3/4 of the cake. So which means that if you measure inequality by the ratio of the income of the B cake received by person B to A, you will find that B gets the cake 4 times more than the person A gets. So that, in my view, is an unfair distribution of the cake. Because assuming that both persons like cake, both have the same appetite. So what is the justice? What is the justification that person A gets only 1/4 of the cake? Supposing you can have further unjust situation where A may gets only 10% of the cake and B gets 90% of the cake. So that will be even more highly unjust distribution. So this is we are concerned about the just and fairness of the division of income. Now, this is a simple idea of inequality when you have only two persons. Now, let me move on to three persons, A, B, and C. Now here I'm considering 4 distributions, distribution 1, 2, 3, and 4. In distribution 1, A gets 400 rupees, B gets 400, C gets 400. The total income is 1200. And then distribution 2, A gets only 100, B gets 400, C gets 700. Similarly, distribution 3 is another distribution 4. So if these are the shares, income shares, what you do is divide the income of A by the total income divide the income of B by the total income. So you get the income shares. So here you can see that income share here, the A, B, C getting exactly the same income shares. And distribution 2, A gets a share of 1 upon 12, B gets a share of 4 upon 12, and C gets the share of 7 divided by 12. And then 1 upon 12, 4, so this is the third distribution and fourth distribution. Now the point I'm making is that if we look at these shares of 3 people, you can only say that distribution B is more unequal than distribution 1. Distribution 2 is more unequal than distribution 1. Distribution 3 is more unequal than distribution 1. And distribution 4 is more unequal because distribution 1 is the most equal. But from here, we cannot make any judgment, inequality between distribution 2, 3, and 4. Because in case of 2 persons, you can easily make the distinction. You can rank the 2 people the distributions, but here you cannot, because you don't know. We cannot say that whether distribution 3 is better than distribution 2 or distribution 4 is better than distribution 3 or vice versa. So you can see that from going from 2 persons to 3 persons, it becomes very difficult. The concept of inequality becomes very difficult. You cannot say which distribution is more equal than the other. And in practical situations, we don't have 2 persons or 3 persons. We have millions of people, in a country. For instance, India has a population of 1.3 billion. So you have to measure the inequality among how much is the inequality among 1.3 billion people. How inequality is changing over time. Is it increasing or decreasing? How particular policies can impact the inequality. For instance, India runs many welfare programs. They have a guaranteed employment program in India. And we want to know what is the impact of that program on inequality, whether benefits of that program are going to the poor or going to the rich. The issue is becoming much more complex when you have so many people. In China, population is 1.4 billion. So we want to measure the inequality of income of the entire population of China or entire population of India. So you can see that problem is much more difficult. This is what I want to emphasize, that inequality can be very simple for 2 persons, but when you have more than 2 persons, it can become very complex. So what we do of measuring inequality when there are millions of people in a country. Now, Lawrence curve is one of the tools which is commonly used in measuring inequality. This curve was suggested by Lawrence, and it's a graphical device, very simple curve, graphical device to represent and analyze the size distribution of income. So explain, but I want to explain now the idea of Lawrence curve in a simple way. Supposing there are 5 people whose incomes are 2, 3, 5, 6, and 8. So total income comes out to be 24 rupees or dollars. What you do is you find out the cumulative proportion of people. For instance, if there are 5 people, 1 person is one of the 5. So it's a 20% population. Supposing, you can come. Similarly, second person, 40% of the population. And third person, if you include, then 60%, 80%, and 100%. So this is the cumulative proportion of the people when they are arranged in ascending order of the income. P is the cumulative proportion of people whose incomes are less than or equal to 2, 3, 5, 6, and 8. P is 20 by 100, 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, and 100%. I mean, if you have done statistics, you must have come across probability distribution function. There's no difference between P and probability density function. Probability density function is proportion of people who have income less than given income X. So P is equivalent to probability distribution function. Lorentz curve, here this is the proportion of individuals, a proportion of the population, but Lorentz curve is the proportion of income of these people. So for instance, 20% of the population receiving 8.3% of income, 40% of the population getting 20.8% of the income, 60% of the population receiving 41.7% of the income, and 80% 66, and 100% all, it covers the whole population. So you can see that poorer you are, smaller is the share. The smaller is the value of the Lorentz curve. So the Lorentz curve is the curve between P and LP. P is the x-axis and LP is the y-axis. So this curve is the relationship between proportion of people, or proportion of the population, and against the proportion of their income. Very simple idea, okay? So this is the shape of the Lorentz curve. If here you can see that along this line is the P, the proportion of population, cumulative proportion of population, this is the cumulative proportion of their income. Now this line 0 to O to B, this is called the egalitarian line, where everybody has the same income. Say bottom 20% of the population has a 20% income, bottom 40% population has 40% income, and bottom 80% has 80% income, and so on. So you get a line, this is called the egalitarian line, when everybody gets the same income. So this is a line of perfect equality, or we call it egalitarian line. Lorentz curve always lies below this line because the share of the income keeps on increasing. Bottom 20%, as you saw, got only 6% of the income, and bottom 40% got 21% of the income, and so on. So you can see that Lorentz curve will always be lying below this line. So this is the line of equality, or egalitarian line, and this is the line of inequality. So if this curve coincides with this line, then we can have perfect equality. And if this line, this curve coincides with this horizontal and vertical axis, it means that the poorest person gets no income, zero income, and richest person gets all the income. Imagine, that the country where one person gets all the income or all the cake when you divide the cake, and other person doesn't get anything. So that is the case of perfect inequality. So if the curve coincides with this, is the case of perfect equality, and if this coincides with here, is the case of perfect inequality. So this curve is very important. If it goes up, if it is higher, then inequality is declining or reducing. And if this curve goes below, it falls down, then income inequality is increasing. So this is the way, that you can see graphically how to measure inequality, because inequality, in a sense, that deviation of this curve from this line intuitively conveys the meaning of inequality, that how much you are deviating from perfect inequality, perfect equality. The larger is the deviation of this curve from this line, more will be the inequality. Now let's see how we can calculate this curve for these four hypothetical distributions we talked about. As you see that there were three people, so each getting, P is 4%, 4, 8, and 12. There are three people. This is a 1/3 of income. This is a 2/3 of people, and then 100 all persons. Now here you can see that this is the share of income. So here you can see that bottom 1/3 of the, the 4 upon 12, this is 4 upon 12, this is 8 upon 12, 12 upon 8. So this Lorentz curve is same as this, P. So this is the P egalitarian line, and this is the Lorentz curve. And if this curve coincides with this, there's a perfect equality. So this is the case of perfect equality in the distribution 1. But distribution 2, you can see that there's no perfect equality. This is a more unequal, this is unequal, and this is unequal. But interestingly here, if you see distribution, compare the distribution 2 and 3. I mean, you can see that here, this curve is higher than this. In L3P and L2P, this is the share is 5.5. This is divided by 12 and 5 divided by 12. So this is the same, but this is higher, this is higher. So this curve is higher than this. In this situation, we can say that distribution 3 is more equal than distribution 2. Now let us see distribution 3 and 4. What happens? Here, this curve is higher than this, but here it is lower than this, which means it's higher here, lower here, and equal here, which means that these two curves are intersecting. So when they intersect, then we cannot judge whether distribution 3 is more equal or distribution 4 is more equal. If one curve lies over at all points above, then you can say that inequality has decreased. But here you cannot say because the curves are intersecting. So the Lorentz curve can be a powerful tool, but at the same time, it is possible that it does not provide the complete ranking of income distribution. Some cases we may not be able to judge which distribution is more equal than the other. So the Lorentz curve criterion provides only partial ranking of individual income distributions. You cannot get a complete ranking. So in the literature, many inequality measures have been proposed to find out the complete ranking of all income distributions. Actually, if you look at the income distribution all over the world, draw the Lorentz curves, you will find that almost 50% or maybe 40% of the cases, the Lorentz curve intersect. So which means that in 40% of the situations, you cannot judge which country is more equal than the other. So Lorentz curve has these limitations that maybe 60% of the cases you may be able to rank all the countries, but 40% Lorentz curve may fail to rank in distributions. Now let me give you some example. You know, Lao PDR is a very small country. And it used to be it's a communist country. And for Asian Development Bank, I went to work on Lao PDR. It is near Bangkok, near Thailand, you know, not very far from Thailand. So the government there was giving high priority to economic growth. They thought that we should not worry too much about the distribution or inequality. We should just enhance the economic growth, increase the economic growth, and that will increase the welfare of the people. So a government accomplished its objectives by emphasizing on macroeconomic stability, policy, maintaining stability, low inflation, promoting domestic and foreign investment. And they didn't worry about inequality. So let's see what is the outcome. I was working when I got access to these surveys, household surveys. Now you can see here that 92, 93 Lorentz curve is above all points in 97, 98 Lorentz curve. We conclude that inequality between 92 and 93 has increased. 97, 98 inequality is higher than inequality in 92, 93, which means that inequality has increased in Laopedia because government did not concern about inequality. They concerned about economic growth, increasing the economic activities in the economy by investments and keeping low inflation and trying to increase the activities in the economy. So this is an example where you promote economic growth, but same time, the benefits of economic growth don't go to all people. They are not shared equally by people. So this is an example of anti-pro-poor policies, where the poor are getting proportionally less share of economic growth than the non-poor. Non-poor are benefiting more from the economic growth than the poor. And because the inequality has increased. So this is the case of anti-poor policies. Government has followed in Laopedia. Okay, so if you don't have any question, we can proceed. Now, I want to introduce you two concepts. First, I want to introduce you to relative Lorentz inequality curve. Here you can see that when Lorentz curve equal to P, P is the egalitarian line. When they are equal, then there is no inequality. This is the situation when LP is equal to P. It's a situation of perfect equality. So this deviation of Lorentz curve from P, in a way, measures the deviation of inequality from the perfect equality. So it, in some sense, captures the essence of inequality. So this curve is similar to the Lorentz curve. I call it a variant of Lorentz curve, and it can be measured like 2 times P minus LP. I will explain why we are choosing 2. Now, one characteristic of this curve is that when incomes of everyone in society is increased or decreased by the same proportion, the curve does not change. For instance, if you double the incomes of everybody, inequality does not change. Curve does not change at all. So such a curve is called relative inequality curve. And all the inequality measures which are derived from such a curve are called relative or rightist measures of inequality. Now, again, if you study the properties of this curve, it is a bell-shaped curve, increasing first and then decreasing. It's like, increasing first and then decreasing. It's like a inverted U-shaped curve. So it means that the higher the curve is, the more unequal the distribution. And if curve goes down lower, then more equal distribution. So how this curve moves is similar to the Lorentz curve. It's not very different, but just you curve going up and down, and you can find out, you can judge whether inequality is increasing or decreasing. Now, another idea, this was the relative inequality. When you double everybody's income, the curve does not change, inequality does not change. That's a relative measure. Now I want to talk to you about absolute Lorentz inequality curve. It was Combe, previously idea was that if you increase everybody's income by the same proportion, inequality should not change. But Combe said, he came out with a sensational idea of absolute inequality, not the relative inequality, but absolute inequality, which does not show any change when income of everybody is increased or decreased by the same amount. If you increase the income of everybody by 100 rupees, inequality should not change. But if you double everybody's income, inequality does not change. That's a relative concept. But this is an absolute concept. Let me give you an example. Supposing there are 2 persons in a society, poor and rich. The poor person has $100 income. Poor person has $100 income, and rich person has 1,000 income. And supposing the government has a policy wants to reduce inequality. So it gives $15 to the poor and $105 to the rich. The government, the social programs government has gives $15% to the $15 to the poor and 105 to the rich. Now you can see here that rich person gets $105 and poor person gets $15, which means that the benefit going to the rich person is almost 7 times more than that of the poor person. So a rich person, if he gets 105, he can buy 7 times more goods and services than the poor. So such a policy will be called absolutely anti-poor, because the rich is getting 107 times more income. He can buy goods and services. He can buy from the market 7 times more goods and services. So his benefits are lot more than the benefits of the poor. So this is called absolutely anti-poor. But if you look at the percentage terms, the poor is getting 15% of the income. Additional income is 15%. And rich is getting only 105. So it's getting much less than 15%. It's getting just 5%. So the poor is getting higher proportion than the rich. So in the relative terms, relatively, poor is better off than the rich. Actually, this is not 10%, this is 5%. Okay, not 10%, this is a mistake here. So here you can see that relative concept, policy is pro-poor. That we can say that this government policy is pro-poor because poor are getting proportionally more income or benefit than the non-poor. But if you look at the absolute difference, the poor are worse off than the non-poor. But if you look at the relative difference, the poor are better off than the. So the two concepts, absolute and relative concepts, they can give you contradictory conclusion to whether a policy is pro-poor or pro-rich. I mean, this is a new idea which came with Combe in late 70s. When I started writing of the book, it was, this concept didn't exist, but now it has become very popular that absolute inequality can be very important. But in most of the research work, most of the work on inequality, they focus on relative measure of inequality. Inequality is relative. But he said that absolute inequality can also make a lot of sense. Let's move on. So two concepts can give quite different judgment of the pro-poorness of the policies. Now, we talked about relative inequality curve. Now, this is the absolute inequality curve. You have to multiply by the mean income. Mu is the mean income. So this is also a bell-shaped curve. If this curve goes up, then absolute inequality goes up. If this curve goes down, absolute inequality goes down. Okay? So, and so very similar to the relative idea, relative inequality curve. This is an absolute inequality curve. You have to just multiply by mean income mu. That's it. Nothing else. So now you can see, let's compare India and China. India and China, this is a relative Lawrence inequality curve. Now here you can see that Chinese inequality is above that of Indian inequality everywhere. The curve is everywhere above that of India. Chinese curve is above all points over India. So from here we can conclude that China's inequality is higher than that in India. India is more equal than China. Okay, this is the conclusion we draw using the relative inequality curve. Now look at the absolute inequality curve. Similar curve is a bell-shaped curve. Both are bell-shaped curves. Now here you can see that Chinese curve is much higher than that of India. Now you can see the difference between these is very large. It means what do we conclude? That absolute inequality in China is much more than that in India. I mean, the difference here, the difference is very small. You can see only the small difference. But here, when you calculate the absolute inequality, the difference between the two becomes much wider. Why it is happening? Because China has much higher income than India, maybe 5 or 6 times higher than the mean income in India. Actually, India, during its economic development, right up to 90s, mid-90s, its growth rate was about 3%, 3.5%, and population was growing about 2% or 2.5%. So the average growth rate in India from 1947 to mid-90s was around, per capita growth was about 1%. So India was growing at the rate of 1% over a long period of time. But China was growing much faster. In three or 4 decades, China's growth rate was as high as 10%, more than 10%. And per capita basis, it was around 6%, 6% or 7%. So China, per capita standard of living was increasing very rapidly compared to that in India. But then they paid the price that inequality in China was higher, but absolute inequality even much higher than India. So there's a trade-off between inequality and growth. So this is an important point to make here, that here, in many situations, Lawrence curve cannot provide complete ranking of income distributions. I mean, my experience says that if you make the international comparisons about Lawrence curve can fail to provide complete ranking in about 40% cases. So there are measures of inequality which have been proposed, which provide the complete ranking. So Gini index is the one most popular measure. It's a relative measure, does not change if everybody's income is increased or decreased by the same proportion. If everyone's income is doubled, its value remains the same. Now, as I pointed out in the Lawrence curve, there's the egalitarian line and the Lawrence curve. So if Lawrence curve deviates from the egalitarian line, more it deviates, more is the inequality. So Gini index is basically area between Lawrence curve and egalitarian line. It actually equal to twice the area between Lawrence curve and egalitarian line. So which means that Gini index is 1 minus twice the area under the Lawrence curve, and area under the relative inequality curve provides you the Gini index. So Gini index comes just by finding the area under the relative inequality curve. And Gini index, how to calculate Gini index, it's not very obvious by using the Lawrence curve how to calculate. So I'm giving you this simple formula of calculating the Gini index. And you can see that is mouse. Yeah, okay. Now here you can see that mu is the mean income and xi is the income of the ith person. So what you do is you arrange the incomes of everybody by increasing by their income. So the poorest person has the lowest rank of 1, and richest person has the highest rank of n. So, so this is the mean income. So this gives you the deviation of ith person's income from the mean. So this is called, and divided by mu. So this we call it relative income shortfall from the mean. Relative income shortfall from the mean. So larger the income shortfall, the poorer the person. And smaller the income shortfall, the richer the person. So the Gini index is basically weighted average, that this is the weight attached to this income shortfall. N plus 1 minus I divided 2 times divided by n into n plus 1. So this weight sums up to 1. So it's a weighted average, So Gini is basically the weighted average of the income shortfalls, and weights are proportional to ranking of the individuals, the ranking. So it was sense idea that if you rank everybody's income, a person with the lower rank suffers deprivation because he thinks that there are more people above him. So the person with low rank suffers deprivation, and person with higher rank does not suffer that kind of deprivation. So this, in a way, the ranking actually determines how much deprivation a person is suffering because of his low income. So Sen calls it sort of, rank order. This is called a rank order situation, where the ranks determine how much relatively deprived a person is. So Gini index is the weighted average. So it determines that it adds up the deprivation suffered by everyone in the society, and it finds the weighted average of that. And that's the way the Gini index captures, in a way, the relative deprivation suffered by the society, because it's the aggregate deprivation that society suffers because they are poor, because of the inequality. If everybody has same income, then society does not suffer any deprivation. So Gini index is a measure of deprivation. The more the deprivation, more the unequal society. So this is a very interesting interpretation of the Gini index. So let's do now, using the formula of this Gini index on the hypothetical distribution, distribution 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you can see that distribution 1 is the perfect equality, so Gini index is 0. Distribution 2 is, if you calculate the Gini index, is 0.25, which means that's more unequal. The distribution 2 is more unequal. Distribution 1 is perfectly equal. And then we found out that distribution 3 is 0.23 distribution. So before, when we had a Lorentz curve, we cannot make any judgment about distribution 3 and 4. But now you can make the judgment that distribution 3 and 4 are equal, equally unequal, The inequality here is the same as inequality here. But in case of when you had a Lorentz curve, you cannot make that judgment. Okay? So this is the way you can apply as an exercise. You can apply those formula using this formula and calculate if you can get the same result as I have got. Maybe I have made a mistake, I'm not sure, but can you verify that these results using that distribution, 4 distributions, 0. First distribution is obvious because everybody has the same income equal to mu, so this will become 0, right? But then other cases, you have to calculate that. So as an exercise, it's worth trying for you to calculate. And similarly, I gave you that Lorentz curve for 5 people. Apply this formula to calculate the Gini index for 5 people, in that distribution I gave you. Let me take you, these are the simple examples, but then I try to apply to do some international comparisons. I use the data from Luxembourg survey. They collect a lot of data on different countries. The inequality and other variables. So I wanted to calculate. There are two concepts: average standard of living and inequality. Average standard of living means that mean welfare of everybody, whole society. We calculate the average standard of living by per equivalent adult in gross income. How do we calculate what is per capita equivalent adult? This is a very difficult concept to explain, but in short, I would say that it takes into account the different needs of the household members and also takes into account economies of scale. For instance, household members have, some households have 2 adults, 1 adult, other households have 2 adults, 2 children, and so on. That all households, they differ. Our families, they are different, So how to compare their standard of living, every household. So what you do is we calculate per equivalent adult, taking into account because the children's needs are less than the adults' needs. For instance, a child might need only 50% of the income of the adult. So because needs are different, children don't consume that much, where adults consume more. Adults consume more calories. They have to buy, adult clothes and many other things. The adults' needs are more than that. So that is one way to look into the equivalent adult. But another is also the larger households, they economize. There are economies of scale in larger households. For instance, if you have a household of 2 persons and household of 1 person, the expenditure of household of 2 persons will not be double that of the household 1. It will be less than double, because they can economize, because they can share many things at households, For instance, they don't have to buy, if there are 2 members, 1 member, they don't have to buy 2 TVs if they have 2 members. They can watch the same TV, 2 of them, without sacrificing their welfare. Similarly, household, there are public goods and private goods within the households. So public goods they share, and which means that they economize on their expenditure. Okay, so that's the idea of per equivalent adults. That's the way we calculate the standard of living of households or families. Now, so I'm doing all these adjustments. I calculated how much will be the standard of living of different countries, India, Brazil, Russia, France, UK, So India has, and also, that there's another point, that the point is that, how to calculate, because in India, when you calculate the income, it is measured in rupees. And if you calculate income in Germany, it is measured in euro. If you calculate income in USA, it is measured in dollars. So the different you have to bring comparison is not possible, because Indian rupees you cannot compare with American US dollars. So one idea is that convert every currency into exchange rate. But exchange rate fluctuates so much, does not reflect the price levels. So we have an idea of PPP, purchasing power parity. It was a project long ago, started in 70s in USA, that purchasing power parity, that what you do is you compare the prices of different countries and make adjustment to their income. So you find a new exchange rates, which is called PPP exchange rates. So these exchange rates, which I have calculated, they are for 211 year, PPP 211. So they are $211, in year, whatever was the inflation, that was the, comparison. So now you can see here that India has $1,687 income per year in PPP. Brazil has almost five times, 6,000. Russia has the 15 times. USA has the standard of living, average standard of living 28,600. So US is the richest in the standard of living, richest country. Then Canada, Australia. Australia and Canada are very similar. Then we have Germany, Finland, UK. And so India is the poorest country here, and Brazil is the next poor in this sample of 10 countries. Okay. If you are not clear about this idea, I can explain again properly. The idea of PPP, the purchasing power parity, if you have not heard of it before. So another is, then I calculate the Gini index of the same countries, with the same standard of living. India is the poorest and US is the richest. So this is the Gini index. So you can see that Gini index declines. It's very high in India and Brazil. It declines, and then America income is America is the richest country, but it is a very high inequality compared to all these countries. I mean, that is that goes against America, that being the richest country, but they are very unequal country. Very unequal. So this is the basic idea. This is the Gini index and how Gini index varies with the average standard of living. But if you look at the absolute Gini index, you can see that absolute Gini means absolute inequality. It goes on increasing. The US is very high inequality, absolute inequality. Now, this is a dilemma that when your standard of living goes up, average standard of living goes up, the gap between rich and poor also goes up. Okay, so absolute inequality keeps on increasing. So this is a dilemma that many economists, they focus on economic growth. That economic growth is a very important indicator of economic development, but it increases the standard of living, average standard of living, but at the same time, also it increases the gap between poor and the rich. So this is a dilemma which is not understood by many people. I mean, I am raising these issues that growth also has a cost. That when you have a high economic growth, as you saw in case of China had very high economic growth, but compared to India, its absolute inequality is too high. You can see the gap between the two is very, very high. So this is an important point, that this is a dilemma which economists are not able to sort it out. I'm raising these issues, but it needs some more attention, how much we should focus on economic growth. So this is, these are the presentations. So let me just concluding remarks that in this presentation, as you know, that I pointed out that idea of inequality is both very simple and very complex. I have attempted to explain it in a layman's language. Now, inequality measures, I must emphasize, are not just statistical devices. You calculate the dispersion and you get inequality. They are not the statistical justice. They have, if they have any policy relevance, then we must relate them to normative notion of social welfare. Whether particular distribution is just or not just, what inequality is tolerable by the society, what inequality is not tolerable by the society. For instance, we saw economic growth. You achieve such a high economic growth, but then absolute inequality increases. So how much is absolute inequality tolerable? How much is not tolerable? So these are the ethical issues which are very important. And when you are talking about inequality, okay, what is fair inequality and what is just inequality? This is a core question, core issue of any society. And again, I have emphasized relative and absolute concepts of inequality. And as I pointed out, that two concepts can give very different judgment about the appropriateness of policies. So my view is that we should use both concepts to evaluate public policy. As I pointed out, that empirical evidence which I have presented, that economic growth has a cost. When you increase economic growth, you increase the gap between poor and the rich. And so in this lecture, I have focused on inequality in income space. I have only focused on income, but we can have inequality in the space of well-being. For instance, there can be inequality in health, inequality in education, living conditions. So that becomes, inequality issue becomes a lot more complex, because inequality then becomes a multidimensional concept, much harder. For instance, inequality in health, for instance, is very important. For instance, in USA, for instance, any hospital you go, a doctor you see, the health services, medical services are very, very expensive. So the people have to have insurance. So in America, the richest country in the world, 50 million people didn't have any health insurance. So they could not see the doctor because they could not afford to see the doctor. So that is the inequity which is very important. That America has very, very high inequality in health services. Actually, my hypothesis is that America has a very bad impact of coronavirus, because it has the highest number of deaths, highest number of infections, because their health system is not equitable. And everybody does not get access to the health care. And also, the policies they adopt, they are very bad policies. And that is why America has now become number one in terms of the effects of the coronavirus. So that is very important, that there can be inequity in health, inequity in education, for instance, that some people are able to go to Harvard University and other people are completely illiterate in America. So that is a high inequality in education. And similarly, you can have inequality in living conditions. For instance, you can live in a house with $1 billion house, and people are living in slums too. So there's inequity in living conditions. So that's very important. So inequality is actually a multidimensional concept, which makes it considerably more complex to measure. So it will be a challenge to explain measuring the multidimensional inequality in a layman's language. So will be my next project.